welcome to Viewpoints. I'm Chris Graham.
And I'm Crystal Graham.
So, the 2016 presidential election, Crystal, has us talking about a lot of things, but among them are how we conduct our elections. I think it's been really interesting to hear the conversations that have popped up about how we count votes, how we apportion things, just a lot of discussions around those issues.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And of course, now we also look at the Virginia state level and how votes are counted there and how people are elected there as well.
Oh, yeah, that's part of this. And what we're going to focus on today, we're not going to talk the national level stuff. That's another issue for another day. But, how we seat people in our Virginia House of Delegates, in our Virginia State Senate, is the focus of today's show. And we're going to bring in Brian Cannon from OneVirginia2021. Welcome, Brian.
Hey, guys. Thanks so much for having me.
And so OneVirginia2021, it's all about fair redistricting. What is fair redistricting?
Sure. Well, we're an organization, a bunch of folks from all across the political spectrum, from as far right, as far left, libertarian, you name it, came together about 3 years ago and said these districts for State House, State Senate, and Congress, they don't belong to any political party. And they certainly don't belong to any politician, incumbent or otherwise, but they belong to the Virginians, right? They belong to the people who live in those districts. And so they decided that it was we could put forward a good, fair redistricting plan, and fair is an operative word here, that doesn't benefit one party or individual, that's just designed for the community and for the people who live in there, so you don't have these crazy districts like we live in today.
Well, and we were talking about that on the drive here today. We were talking about just some people in our area alone, from Ben Klein to Cree Deeds, Steve Landis. Their districts are a little crazy, where they stretch.
Yeah, and we'll use those examples because that's where we're based here in the Valley. But when you're talking about, say, Dickie Bell's 20th House District, it goes from Nelson County all the way to Deerfield on the extreme western part of Augusta County. Yeah. You've got Steve Landis from Crozet, part of Rockingham County, above Waynesboro, doesn't include Waynesboro. Cree Deeds, his Senate district actually represents all the way from Bath County, a little sliver through Rockbridge County, all the way over to Albemarle County. And I think I have this right. His House district that he lives in would go all the way to Blacksburg. So kind of weird how we draw these lines. We're trying to make sense of that, right, Brian?
Yeah, absolutely. And the only way to make sense of the current lines is to know that they were drawn by politicians for politicians. They don't have anybody else's interest in mind when they're drawing that except for that. And I think that's the exact opposite of what we should be doing.
Yeah. So now, let's break this down to the average voter, right, Crystal? I mean, we want to know what this means. If you're out there watching, you've been thinking about the presidential election in particular, you're thinking electoral college. How does redistricting at the state level, how does that impact me?
Sure. Our Congress and our State House and State Senate don't get much done, right? And for a national level for a second, just to think about Congress. I mean, forget something controversial like passing a budget. For God's sakes, they do that, right? Or forget anything like entitlement reform or some addressing the mass shootings issue or anything like that. Pick an issue. Just look at Zika funding, right? That is coming up our East Coast, our Southeast. It's going to be a bigger deal when the weather hopefully starts to warm up in a couple months. And it's going to be a much bigger deal. And those mosquitoes are biting Republicans and Democrats alike. Yet President Obama requested emergency funding for that in February. And Congress still hasn't gotten around to doing it. Now, it's not because it's a partisan issue. It's because they're just in perpetual state of gridlock and they don't get anything done. And we, as the citizens, are impacted horribly by this. They can't address the big issues we have. And you can look at transportation in Virginia. You can look at education. You can look at all sorts of things that we have to get done, and yet legislators spend too much time focusing on the base of their elections, the 3 to 5% who show up in a primary, because that's the only competition they have. And they don't worry about the general population. So you have plenty of issues where there's 60, 70, 80% of Virginians support, and yet no action is taken on it by the General Assembly. Forget whether the action's conservative or liberal or anything, but just no action at all.
I think we should take a step back just for a minute. We talk about how right now the redistricting is done by legislators, but maybe you could just explain a little bit about how it's done now,
sure.
And then of course, how differently you'd like to see it done.
Sure. In Virginia, it's how a bill becomes a law. So it's introduced into the General Assembly. It has to pass both chambers, so both the House and the Senate, and then it's signed by the governor. And it's really that simple. Unfortunately, it's the most political. It's like people talk about sausage making. This is the worst of that because it's so personal to these legislators. Other states have found ways to do this better, from Iowa to Ohio to Idaho to California, Washington, Arizona. Even New York has a better process than Virginia does, and that's a real problem. And you're seeing the gridlock in Virginia. We're never that far from D.C., but metaphorically not that far from D.C. in terms of our politics either.
Is that a difficult sell to the legislators, of course, though, because of course they're drawing it to their interest, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, whoever's in charge at that time, they're drawing it and it's to their benefit. So how do you convince them that these other states are doing it better?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the first and foremost thing is you look at where we are currently in Virginia, which is a state where we have almost zero competition. So let's start with last November, every member of the General Assembly that was up for re-election won re-election. So that's out of 140 General Assembly offices, 122 of those folks sought re-election. Every single one of them won. And there were about 70 seats out of the 100-member House that were completely unopposed by a major party candidate, and about half in the state Senate that were. I mean, literally, there's no competition left. You look at Congress nationally, there are 435 voting seats. Of those 435 seats, only 37 were considered competitive across the country. I mean, this is a major problem. And so if you are like an average person that thinks a little bit of competition could make things a little bit better, we've wrung that out of our political process by rigging these districts to benefit incumbents.
How many current state legislators have signed on to the effort OneVirginia21 is proposing?
Sure. Well, we've got a couple of different proposals. So, not everybody has to agree with everything we want to do. Some proposals that include a commission, some different types of commissions, some proposals that just include making political gerrymandering illegal and keeping cities, counties, and towns together, like good rules, right? You could think of like an umpire and an umpire's rule book, right? You kind of need both, but either one would be helpful. And so we usually pass the state Senate either unanimously or nearly unanimously. I think our low point was out of 40, we got 28 votes. So that's kind of where we stand there. So it's pretty strong support in the state Senate, including state senators from this area of town. And then in the state House, we don't really get a big vote. Oftentimes we don't get a vote at all in the state House. Sometimes we do, and it's a subcommittee that meets at 7 a.m. and they will kill the bill on a 4-3 or 5-2 vote. And so we don't really know in the House. A lot of these folks aren't on record. From lobbying and having informal conversations, I think we've got 60 or 65 votes in that House of Delegates out of 100 that would be in favor of reform, but the House leadership is structured in such a way that it keeps these bills from getting to the floor, which is a real injustice to Virginia voters who want to see something happen, but a good example of gerrymandering protecting these folks.
So we're heading into 2017's Virginia General Assembly session. Just for the process standpoint, these reapportionments are done every 10 years based on the census. So the next one's in 2020. The legislative reapportionment would then be done 2021. So there's a few years between now and 2021. How do you break that logjam?
Yeah. So I think that's the operative question, is how do we get folks who are self-interested in this, who have benefited from the system, to change the system? And I think the number one thing to know is there are people in our General Assembly who believe this is just the right thing to do and want to fix it, such as Emmett Hanger, such as Steve Landis, such as Jill Vogel, such as Cree Deeds. People that are there that just say, look, I want to win as much as the next person, but I don't want to win a rigged game. The rest, but that's not enough to win, right? The rest of the people to take you over the hump is to shame them, right? Is to have people know that people are watching when they take these votes to kill gerrymandering reform efforts or to redistrict fairly. And if you raise that conscious level for people, I think it looks a lot like campaign finance reform looked 16 years ago. If you all remember, John McCain ran for president the first time on that issue. And it passed Congress and it was signed into law by George W. Bush. And a lot of folks didn't like it. And McCain-Feingold was a complex piece of legislation. It's been gutted by the courts because of First Amendment concerns that gerrymandering doesn't, or redistricting reform doesn't have. But you got a lot of folks to vote in Congress to reform the soft money gravy train, the renting out the Lincoln bedroom, all the kind of worst of the worst. You got them to vote against that self-interest because people were watching. And that's what we have to know. This is easily a 70-30 issue in Virginia in terms of people wanting reform. It's just a question of, are they going to raise it up to the ethical question of the day, the way campaign finance reform was done 15 or 16 years ago?
This is your full-time job. We were talking about you travel a lot. We're talking about 2021. You have an obvious deadline to try to achieve this, so to speak. The census happens in 2020. When do you feel like that the legislators have to make a decision on this? And then what's your plan for that? Well,
the biggest first deadline, right, is actually this General Assembly session. This is a first read constitutional amendment session. So they have a chance. We need to reform the Constitution to change this, to really change this. And the first chance to do it is this session in January and February. If they can pass a bill in January or February, Then there's an intervening election, which our Constitution requires. Then they come back, and step 2 is to pass the same legislation again. It's really onerous. Virginia does not like amending its Constitution. But after it's passed the General Assembly twice, then it would go to a popular vote of the people. We all had to vote on 2 constitutional amendments this past November, so it'll look the same. And hopefully we'll get a good bill before the people so that they can have their voices heard on this. And I'm pretty confident we'll pass overwhelmingly. So that's the nearest deadline, and why this year is so important. They don't often hear first read bills in even years, so an odd year is important. That being said, it's not the drop dead last moment we have. 2019 will be that, but we'd like to get it fixed before then, because I think what's important is nobody knows who's going to be the governor going forward, and nobody knows who's going to control the state Senate. I think the state House is pretty much a lock for Republicans for quite a while, but nobody knows who's going to control the state Senate, and that won't be determined until 2019. So if we can set fair rules now before we know exactly who would benefit from the gerrymandering, then that's the way to do it.
I know this isn't results oriented, but when you talk with partisan Democrats on this issue, and this could be one of the complicating factors about how to actually achieve nonpartisan redistricting. Virginia has currently Democrats in all 3 statewide offices. Both senators are Democrats, and yet you have a House that's 2/3 Republican. And so that would tell you that results-oriented process gives you a system that shows gerrymandering as an effect. But Virginia's Democrats seem so concentrated, certainly in relative few Northern Virginia precincts, that it could be challenging to, if you were simply looking at results and saying, we want a state that more represents our partisan distribution vote-wise, how do you take those Democrats from those relative few parts of Virginia in the northeastern part of the state and spread them out? It's a challenge, I'm sure, from the standpoint of once you get to the nonpartisan redistricting to actually achieve that.
Oh, absolutely. And our organization is focused on a fair process, not a fair outcome. If the Democrats win or lose under this, it doesn't matter. Same for Republicans. That's the party's responsibilities. I think Democrats have to figure out how to run in the suburbs better, and Republicans probably need to figure out how to run in our cities better. But that's not our issue. Our issue is to set a fair process and let the communities pick their voters, or let the communities pick their politicians instead of the other way around. I think you're right. And what you're talking about a little bit, Chris, is called residential sorting. We choose to live near people who live and think like we do, and that's totally fine. And that's our First Amendment right to do so. Now, some of that's a historical legacy of redlining neighborhoods and things like that, but generally speaking, it's a choice we make today. And what the academic literature says on that is that does have some effect, but it doesn't have a complete effect that people would think. Some people say, oh, it's not gerrymandering at all. It's just that people live where they want to live near people who think like they do. That's probably about 7% of the story, but there's usually double the impact of gerrymandering on that. And there's a Wisconsin case out of the partisan efficiency gap that went into that a little bit.
I'm curious, we get back to this average voter aspect that we talk about, and with the governor's elections coming up in 2017, I'm just curious, that's not going to be a driving issue that gets people to the polls to vote, yet the governor actually holds a lot of power as far as what we actually do, right? What's his role? Yeah,
the next governor we elect in Virginia will have the opportunity to sign into law or veto any maps passed by the General Assembly. It'll be their last year, and it'll be exactly their responsibility to do so. So they are the backstop if we can't fix anything in the General Assembly session. I'll tell you that Ralph Northam is the likely Democratic nominee. He's been a huge redistricting reform supporter from day one. There's a couple of folks running or looking at running from the Republican side. We don't know who's going to emerge. Some of them have been good redistricting reform supporters. Some of them have been a part of the problem previously. So it's important, and I don't think it's going to be the driving choice. I mean, most people want to vote on taxes and education and transportation, but I think if you look at this issue of fair redistricting, it's really a hallmark of how ethical your person is, right? How ethical your politician is. Are they willing to put aside what might be an opportunity for them to rig the game and instead allow more competition and communities to have their voice heard? Are they willing to do that and perhaps risk their seat or risk one of their colleagues' seats to do that? And I think that, I think gerrymandering only protects subpar politicians who couldn't get elected in a competitive district, but some of those subpar politicians are worried.
Is there a possibility that down the road this kind of effort could lead to, we see some states even considering, I guess, their multi-member district type things, where people who are not partisan Democrats or Republicans, who are third party at heart, will say that no matter how we do a nonpartisan redistricting, I'm a Green Party person, I'm a libertarian, and I can't possibly be represented in the current system because it's still a winner-takes-all kind of process. Is there any look that way down the road implementing a system that can, also reflect those third and fourth party folks.
Absolutely. I mean, our organization isn't focused on that, but as somebody who studied this in law school and who pays attention to this, absolutely. And I think we really should look at a way, how do we get our communities reflected in our legislatures, right? And if you look at it now, there's simply not. But I think there's instant runoff voting where you can do ranked choices. Maine just passed that recently. And I think that's a great step to look at. Virginia has a bit of a sordid history on multi-member districts. They've used historically to disenfranchise minority communities. Though that being said, if done correctly, it's a way to empower a diverse group of people to represent the area. Maryland does it okay, and there's other states that do it as well. Virginia certainly should look at that as well. But I mean, as a baseline, I view that kind of as those are luxury items. The step one is getting districts not drawn by politicians for politicians.
Mm-hmm.
So you talk a little bit about appealing to the ethics of the legislators, so to speak, in this decision, and I'm just a little curious about the history of all of this. If it's as easy as that, as easy as appealing to that, then how come it hasn't been done before?
Sure. Well, I think that only gets us so far. I think there's a lot of politicians who support that, but then there's some that you really have to shame into it and highlight. You got to shine a little bit of a light on that, and that'll help. I think when I was in 2011, I was in my last year of law school, and I was really hoping we'd get redistricting reform. And the reason I thought so is because we had split control of our General Assembly, right? The Democrats controlled the Senate, and the Republicans controlled the House. And I thought, here we go, guys. This is the chance for put your partisan, guns down and come up with a better process. There's a couple proposals out there. It's not rocket science how to fix this. Other states have done it. And instead, what we got was both parties gerrymandering each chamber they controlled and then agreeing to pass the other's gerrymander, right? It's the worst form of bipartisanship I've ever seen. It's very disappointing as a reform supporter for decades now. But that's what we saw. So I think you've got to shine a light on this and hold people to account on this issue. I think people do care about this issue. And this is a shorthand for whether my politician is ethical or not. And I think you can. And I think everybody who votes against this says, oh, well, I've never heard about it from people at my house, back in my house district, which is why our effort in the last 3 years has been broader and deeper than other prior reform efforts, of which I've been a part of too. I've been a cheerleader on the sidelines of them. But we've got a way on our website for you to petition your state senator or state delegate right away. If you sign our petition on our website at OneVirginia2021.org, it instantly emails your senator and delegate and tells them you support reform. So they can't say, oh, I've never heard about this back at home.
We've seen some positive move in the direction, at least at the congressional level, with the apportionment of Virginia's congressional seats. We saw the district lines. In fact, in this year's election cycle, effectively a new district was created. The 4th district, I think, was the lines were redrawn. And we saw a new representative result from that. So is that momentum? I mean, is that move in the direction of what OneVirginia21 wants to see?
Yeah, well, I think what that says is the courts aren't going to be passive about this anymore, and that's key. We would love to see a legislative solution. The courts are not our preferred mechanism, but if it takes them to make the legislature do the right thing, we're not going to stand in the way of that, right? We wrote an amicus brief in that case, and basically that was about racial redistricting, and both parties have voted for this. Basically, they packed 55% black voters into the district, the Bobby Scott's old 3rd congressional district. It went from the middle part of Richmond all the way down to Petersburg, across the river down to some parts of Newport News and Hampton, but not all, and then down into Norfolk and Portsmouth in any discernible way you couldn't tell. And it looked horrible, and people took a look at that district and said, this is racial gerrymander. They only did it because they're black. Now, interestingly enough, the defense by the people who drew the lines was, I didn't do it because they're black, I did it because they're Democrats, right? And there's an overwhelming percentage of blacks vote Democratic. So, what's the difference? Our organization's trying to make I did it because they're Democrats, or I did it because fill in the blank partisan affiliation. We want to make that illegal. Right. And I think that's a key part to it. But yeah, what you're seeing is when you unpack that district is you actually have Virginia delegation that starts to look like Virginia. We're a 20% African-American state. Most of that's from Hampton Roads and a little bit from Richmond and Northern Virginia. But now you'll actually have 2 out of 11 congressional representatives be African-American. Now doesn't mean they have to be, but that's just what naturally occurred when you unrigged the system by a law professor out of California who's really smart and just drew the lines in a better way. I mean, they're certainly not perfect, but they're much better than when the politicians here drew it for themselves.
So people who are watching the show, obviously you said they can go to the website, they can sign the petition. What else can the average person do to get involved in this effort?
So we're really good on Facebook. We are not as good on Twitter as we talked about before the show. Redistricting and gerrymandering take up a lot of those 140 characters. We are on Twitter, but really if they're on Facebook, it's the best way to share information. There's a lot of stuff out there about it. They can find our Facebook page and go to it. And I think that's a great way to connect with your community about this issue. We've also got a video on our website that's a pop-up video that's a fake politician called Gerrymandering who supports redistricting reform, or supports gerrymandering in the way we currently do it. And that's a good way to spread the message to people. Really, this is about getting a couple hundred people in every House of Delegates district to stand up and tell their delegate, I care about this, and that I'm watching, and that this system has to get fixed. So it's letters to the editor, it's calling your delegate, it's petitioning through our website, and engaging with us on Facebook. I mean, that's the best way to make a difference, and it's not too hard to do, right? If anybody wants to come on our lobby day, let us know. We're lobbying on January 23rd, but not everybody has to come all the way from out this way into Richmond to do it. You can do it virtually, and we do our best to make that as easy as possible.
So in terms of how these new districts could look in the future, among the things I'm sure are geographical barriers. And we out here in this part of the state anyway, when I go to Richmond, I can't tell where things are because I don't see mountains. Mountains tell me east or west here. In Richmond, everything looks the same.
We use the river, and it's north and south.
Okay, thank you. I'll remember that next time. So out here, we know, mountains are barriers to, like, for example, we talked about our districts here, House districts here, all of which seem to jump mountain ranges.
Yeah.
That could be one way to break things down. Would be and communities on either side of a mountain range don't necessarily go together very well. So that could be one factor. But what could factors be in drawing those districts in the future?
Sure, I think they're existing political boundaries. You all choose to live in Augusta, or you all choose to live in Harrisonburg or wherever for particular reasons that are important to you beyond. Maybe it's just schools, maybe it's neighborhoods or whatever, but we self-select into these they're artificial political boundaries, but they've been around for quite a while. They were partisan or racial, 50, 60 years ago, but today they're kind of settled, and respecting those is important because people respect those, and non-politicians, right? Just average people. But I think what you hit on, Chris, is what I call the Frankenstein effect. Dr. Frankenstein put together bits and pieces of people into a monster. And that's what you see in these communities. They don't keep communities whole when they're drawing these districts. They take the part of that community that they like, that'll vote the way they want, and they lump it in with another part. And so you get these like fragments of communities lumped together into a district that only makes sense to the politician. If you look at it, you'd be like, I don't have anything in common with those people on the other side of the river or the mountain or in that disparate corner of Virginia. They're not like me. They don't have the same interests we do. And I think these Frankenstein districts do a real disservice to the communities that are trying to have their voice heard in the General Assembly.
I would even say in this day and age too. Of course, we text each other, we email each other, etc. But being able to go to an office. I'm thinking of Creed Dean's district again. I mean, he has a Charlottesville office. He lives in Bath County, but just the idea that those two very different communities separated by such a geographic distance makes it really hard to make sense of. A guy who's a lawyer and a farmer in Bath County can represent the urban interests of Charlottesville, and get in a car and go see him can be a difficult thing. And that's something that, dating back to the 18th century, we took for granted that we would have the opportunity to talk face-to-face with our representatives.
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the other reforms that are floating out there, Chris, you talked about multi-member districts, we talked about ranked choice voting, is increasing the number of representatives we have. Going from 435 in Congress to maybe 10x that, right? That sounds crazy, but if you think about it for a second, it would make your politician a lot closer to home. And you could do the same in Virginia. We've got 100 delegates and 40 senators. You could increase that, and it would enable you to have a lot more closer connection to your representative. Because right now, it's pretty tough. Our state house districts are, until the next redistricting, are approximately 80,000 people. Our state Senate district are approximately 200,000 people. And so that's a lot of folks to try to represent. And sure enough, when they gerrymander like this and they cut across communities, I mean, even if you're the representative, just think of how many town councils and city councils and county boards you need to keep up with to be able to fairly do your job. That's if you're trying. And because of the lack of competitive elections, they don't have to try too often.
We just have a couple minutes left, but I'm just curious as to what your job is as executive director leading up to this General Assembly session. Like, what is your role from now to 2021 to get this on the ballot, for everyone?
Yeah, so the two kind of key performance indicators I measure myself by are raising people and raising money. Let me talk about people because that's more interesting for a second. When I started about 2 years ago, we had 3,500 supporters across the state, which is great for a nerdy little issue like redistricting. We've gone from 3,500 to 33,000 in about 23 months. Now, we're really proud of that, but as exciting as that almost 10x growth is, we've got to double that. We really have to continue to go, which is why the petition is so important, why folks writing in and following us on Facebook is so key. But that's one of the ones, that's the most important measure, because if we just leave it up to the politicians, they'll let the status quo go, right? And the other side is on donations. As we get, a lot of these organizations thrive on big donations. We don't. We thrive on normal people giving normal amounts of money, because quite honestly, all the big corporations and all the lobbyists and all the wealthy interests, they like their General Assembly. They like it exactly the way it is because they put a lot of money into it. So if you want to see change, and this applies to on the right, left, center, anywhere, if you want to see change, you've got to support groups that are really advocating for it. So I view my job as raising people and raising money, being showing people that this is a bipartisan issue. A lot of folks think it's that they didn't know the Senate Democrats gerrymandered in 2011 because they didn't realize they had control of the chamber back then. They didn't know that other states have done this and have fixed this. I mean, if you're not paying attention to it, it just seems like an intractable problem. But there are about a dozen states that have fixed this, including states like Virginia that have to go through their legislature.
I'm reminded as we finish up the show here, when we do show prep, Crystal often asks, Chris, why do we do it this way? And my answer to this was because we've always done it this way. We're talking about changing things here. So we talked redistricting, and I think we learned a lot here on our show today.
We did, and of course, people can go online to the OneVirginia2021.org to learn more about this effort.
All right, well, I'll sign off for now. Crystal Graham, Chris Graham, thank you for joining us here on Viewpoints.
Good night.